much for joining us. Just time for a quick recap of the week, and it has been frantically busy. The Senate triggered the nuclear option to put Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court and therefore a lobster onto our all-dog court. Devon Nunes recused himself from the House investigation of Trump's Russia ties after he himself came under an ethics investigation. A classic Devon move. And, of course, on Thursday, there was the biggest news of all.
We are coming on the air right now because President Trump has just ordered a military strike on Syria.
On President Trump's orders, U.S. warships launched between 50 and 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting a Syrian government air base.
Yes, a Syrian airfield this week was bombed by President Trump. Two words that, when placed in a sentence like that, are as downright unsettling as ham smoothie or placenta kimono. And before we get into what we did and why we did it, it is worth taking a moment to acknowledge some of the reactions to the airstrikes themselves, particularly within the media, which occasionally bordered on the orgasmic.
We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments.
What are you talking about? It is a little ironic to see Brian Williams on MSNBC talking about the beauty of our weapons, because that is not a phrase anyone would use if they had, for instance, ever been in a helicopter that was hit by ground fire. And he wasn't even done talking about whatever the fuck he was talking about.
Because life imitates art, there's a scene in The American President where Michael Douglas, playing the fictional president, is being told that an airstrike against a radar installation is proportional and it's presidential. And he chooses to think about the guy who's coming on the night shift as part of a cleaning crew and how he's going to lose his life in this presidential airstrike. Well, the same thing happened tonight, obviously.
No, it didn't. Because first, this is not a song, it's not a movie. We fired real missiles at an actual country. And also, there is nothing obvious about Trump expressing concern for another human being. I am pretty sure the only time he's ever thought about a cleaning crew has been to say, "There's a fingerprint on this vase, don't pay them this week." But it wasn't just the media who were excited. Some of Trump's biggest critics had praise for the strikes, with John McCain and Lindsey Graham saying Trump deserves the support of the American people, and Chuck Schumer saying it was the right thing to do. While, interestingly, some of Trump's most prominent supporters were significantly less happy, including Alex Jones, who even tried to weave a conspiracy around it.
So paradoxically, Trump is really disintegrating and in my eyes, on many levels. But paradoxically, he's doing so much good that I realize they're maneuvering him into bad so they won't call him a Russian agent, so he can look tough to the Russians, so he can look tough to the Chinese, and so he can shut down his critics. That once you feed the pirate, they're going to want more, more, more.
Wait. Once you feed the pirate, they're going to want more. Not only is all of that crazy, that is not even a phrase. I'm against these strikes because you know what they say, if you want to skin a ferret, you better bring your dancing shoes. And I mean it. Once you start washing an alligator, paradoxically, you don't stop till it's dry. But there are some serious questions that need to be answered regarding these airstrikes, which were in retaliation against Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad's apparent use of chemical weapons to target his own people, which is undeniably horrific. But as many have noted, when Assad did the same thing 4 years ago, Trump's response was significantly different.
The attack also a startling about face for President Trump, who has repeatedly argued against military intervention in Syria.
Why do we care? Let ISIS and Syria fight. And let Russia, they're in Syria already, let them fight ISIS.
Tweeting repeatedly after the last major chemical attack in Syria 4 years ago that the United States should stay out of the conflict.
Is there anything Trump is doing now where he didn't at one point tweet about doing the opposite? I honestly would not be surprised if in 2011 he tweeted, "Only a stupid idiot would live in a big White House and sign bills into law. #sad. Now, administration officials have said that it was the gruesome images of the chemical weapons attack that changed Trump's mind, which on one level is absolutely understandable. The images were truly horrifying, just as, again, they were 4 years ago. But while it is natural to want to take some kind of action in response, it has to come in the context of a larger strategy, or it's close to worthless. Because though the strikes seem to have made certain people feel better, what did they actually achieve?
Does this change the facts on the ground at all, Martha?
I don't think it really does. I mean, this wasn't a strategic strike and hurting Assad going forward. It's this one airfield. It is a punishing airstrike. They took out aircraft. They took out fuel supplies. They took out some of the surrounding infrastructure. But he has many other airfields.
It's true. In fact, he apparently still has the one we bombed, because Syrian warplanes were carrying out attacks from it just hours after our missile strike. And that is hardly a crippling blow. Delta passengers experience longer flight delays on a daily basis. Look, maybe a symbolic airstrike was strategically the best move for Trump, but I don't think he's thinking strategically, because there is no indication that he's taken the time to answer some fairly basic questions like, if this was a warning shot, what are we warning against? Do we only want to stop Assad using chemical weapons, or are we going to push for regime change? If he does it again, are we prepared to go to war to stop him? If so, are we prepared for how significantly this may deteriorate our relationship with Russia, and how will that affect our fight against ISIS? This is complicated, and I am not saying there are right answers here. I'm saying there needs to be a tangible strategy acknowledging how difficult taking on Assad actually is, because right now we have a president who feeds off praise, and he just got a lot of it for bombing someone. And that should make everyone very, very worried. Or, to put this in terms that Brian Williams can understand, there is a scene in the movie American Pie where the character Jim, played by Jason Biggs, has sex with a pie because he wants to feel like a big, strong, grown-up man. Well, the concern is that if we blindly let him continue down this path, Donald Trump could become that horny teenager, and the whole world could become that pie. So, for now, let's move on. Let's move on to Fox News. A series of Cialis and Catheter commercials, occasionally interrupted by an episode of The Five. Fox News has been rocked by sexual harassment scandals recently, and this week brought one of the most damaging yet.
This morning, new revelations about sexual harassment claims at Fox News aimed at the network's biggest star. The New York Times finding Fox News and Bill O'Reilly paid 5 women a total of almost $13 million in settlements, going back 15 years.
Yes, Bill O'Reilly, who scientists hypothesise is kind of a dense nebula of boner and racism, has been paying out settlements for alleged harassment for years, and the details are pretty disturbing here, with the victims claiming things like verbal abuse, lewd comments, unwanted advances, and phone calls in which it sounded as if Mr. O'Reilly was masturbating. And I hate to ask this, but what does that sound like? Does it sound like a dog's jowls flapping when it sticks its head out of the window of a moving car? Or someone frantically stirring a bowl of cake batter? Or was it a more subtle tap, 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 like a mouse giving a round of applause? I mean, either way, it is horrible. And look, it's not just those 5 women. Dr. Wendy Walsh, an occasional guest on O'Reilly's show, came forward this week claiming that he took her to dinner, ostensibly to offer her career advice, but when she declined to come back to his room, his tone noticeably changed.
He told me, he complained about I ordered a soda water, and he complained about the cost of the soda water and said, I wonder what they're charging for a cup of water here. He told me my bag was ugly. He goes, that's the ugliest bag I've ever seen.
Okay. Hold on. She is saying when he got rejected, he started negging her by complaining about the price of seltzer and then criticising her fashion choices. Apparently, in Bill O'Reilly's mind, every woman wants to fuck her own mother. Now, it is hard for us, any of us, to imagine what it must be like to be on the receiving end of dirty talk from Bill O'Reilly. But it's not, as it turns out, impossible. Because in 1998, he wrote a book called Those Who Trespass, featuring numerous sex scenes, and he narrated his own audiobook. And yes, we're doing this. Here is a sample.
I would like you to unhook your bra and let it slide down your arms. You can keep your shirt on. Cup your hands under your breasts and hold them for 10 seconds. He slipped the hose down to her ankles, all the while continuing to knead her skin with his tongue. Ashley climaxed twice before the two got up from the couch.
Hot. That is a man describing a woman's orgasm who has clearly never seen a woman's orgasm. And just on a technical note, you can't knead skin with your tongue, Bill. You've confused making love with making a rustic sourdough bread. But wait, because we haven't even got to the most stomach-churning part yet.
He had accomplished his goal, giving Ashley Van Buren a night she would long remember. His physical pleasure was secondary. His primary euphoria came from knowing that Ashley was enjoying every bit of his expertise.
I am willing to bet that there has never been a fictional character more happy to not actually exist than Ashley Van Buren. And yet, so far, Fox News is firmly standing by their man and is citing some pretty weak reasoning.
Fox's parent company points out no current or former Fox News employee ever took advantage of the 21st Century Fox hotline to raise a concern about Bill O'Reilly.
So their defence is he can't be guilty because no one called HR to complain. But why would they? I'd always assumed that Fox News' HR department is just a telephone in an empty room being manned by a horny goat. Now, O'Reilly denies the claims, accusing these women of just wanting money. But Wendy Walsh isn't even asking for money. She just thinks everyone could learn a valuable lesson from this.
All men need to learn that a workplace is not a mating marketplace. And Bill O'Reilly, like the rest of us, needs to just use Tinder.
No, he absolutely does not need to do that. That would be terrible for literally everyone except Bumble, because they would have a rock-solid new ad campaign. That's going to hit hard and hit well. And look, whether O'Reilly is learning his lesson here or not, his advertisers are not hanging around to find out.
We've seen dozens of advertisers, our latest count's around 60 advertisers, go ahead and say, we're not going to run our ads all around the O'Reilly factor anymore.
Well, that is not good news for Bill O'Reilly, and I would say that he should call his advertisers to apologise, but the problem is he might just start jerking off while they're on the phone. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Almost nobody is standing by Bill O'Reilly. Nobody, that is, apart from the President of the United States.
I think he's a person I know well. He's a good person. I think he may, I think he shouldn't have settled. Personally, I think he shouldn't have settled.
How come?
Because you should have taken it all the way. No, I know Bill. Bill's a good person. I don't think Bill would do anything wrong.
Nobody gets to be surprised by that, because it is entirely plausible that the hill our president is willing to die on is the one formed by Bill O'Reilly's workplace erection poking up against his old man slacks. So to recap this story for you, Bill O'Reilly needs advertisers, and Donald Trump needs to understand sexual harassment. And here is where we come in. Because, as you may remember, our Catheter Cowboy has spent this year appearing in ads on Fox News, explaining everything from the nuclear triads to the American Health Care Act. And I think you know where this is going. We have produced an ad to educate Donald Trump to air during the O'Reilly Factor in New York and D.C. We submitted it to stations on Friday, but weirdly, we haven't heard back from them since, which is a little surprising because we are one of the only advertisers offering to buy time on his show at the moment. And I do hope they don't reject this ad, but just in case they do, here's a sneak peek of what we would like the president to see.
Attention catheter patients.
Howdy again. I'm a professional cowboy. I use catheters, and there's two things I know. I don't like pain when I cath, and repeated unwanted sexual advances or obscene remarks in the workplace constitute sexual harassment. If there's a power disparity between the two parties, well, that's about as inappropriate as lubricating a catheter with hot sauce, partner. Why would you do that? I do not like pain when I cath. And if you've got a friend who is accused of something like that over and over again, I might think twice about defending him, because that just contributes to a culture where women don't want to come forward. And I know you might not care about that. But on some level, you gotta know, you're blowing this. You're sacrificing the chance to make society a better place on the altar of your towering ignorance and fragile ego. You are blowing this. That's all for now. Goodbye, everyone watching this, and definitely not one specific person. See you next time.
Moving on. Our main story tonight concerns democracy. Undeniably the best Greek export that doesn't have fruit at the bottom. Now, there is understandable concern at the moment about the personalities harming our democracy, but tonight let's talk about one of the major structural problems, and it's something that Democrats in particular love to complain about.
We have seen Republicans rig the system with their gerrymandering, often illegal gerrymandering.
There is gerrymandering to a fare thee well in states controlled by the Republicans.
Listen, political gerrymandering is probably one of the greatest threats to our democracy right now.
Well, slow down, that is a bit much. The greatest threat to our democracy right now is clearly whatever tweet the president has planned for Cinco de Mayo this year. We don't know yet what it'll be. We don't know which Spanish words will be misspelled, but we can assume it will be horrifying. But gerrymandering is a real problem. It's the practice of drawing voting districts in a way that creates unfair advantages for whoever happens to be drawing the lines, which does sound mundane, but the results can be significant. Gerrymandering is partly responsible for giving Republicans such an edge in the House of Representatives, because take a look at what happened in some states where they drew the district lines.
In Pennsylvania, 44% of the voters chose Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives in 2014. But 13 of the 18 districts, more than 2/3, are represented by Republicans. In Ohio, about 40% of the voters chose Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives. But 12 out of 16 seats, 3/4 of them, are represented by Republicans.
Those numbers are way out of proportion to what people should expect. You wouldn't accept Neapolitan ice cream that was 75% strawberry. How is that okay? What perverts voted for this? So whoever draws the districts has a lot of power, and thanks to technological advances, it's possible to use that power in very precise ways.
In the age of computers, you can gerrymander with scientific precision. You can run in and out of alleys and up and down streets and carefully include and exclude whichever voters you want in one district and not in another. So it's become a very precise science.
He's right about that. Gerrymandering has become a very precise science, and interestingly, it's one of the few remaining types of science in which the Republican Party currently believes. Now, there are different reasons politicians engage in gerrymandering. It's done to disadvantage voters based on race, or on political party, or to shore up seats for incumbents, sometimes even within a party. Take Hakeem Jeffries. In 2000, he ran a strong challenge in a Democratic primary for the New York State Assembly, and he planned to run again in 2002. But the Democrats had done something interesting to the map.
The map that was drawn was absolutely fascinating. They drew a map that literally carved out the block on which Hakeem Jeffries lived from Assembly District 57.
I remember shaking my head in disbelief. There were a lot of people hoping to vote for me, but were surprised to find that they no longer lived in the Assembly District that they had been living in for years, if not decades. Brooklyn politics can be pretty rough, but that move was gangster.
Yeah, it was gangster. And remember, the threshold for gangster in Brooklyn is the notorious B.I.G., whose debut album begins with songs that are respectively about armed robbery, gun violence, armed robbery and gun violence, and being prepared to die by gun violence while committing armed robbery. And this is by no means a new problem. Even the term gerrymandering goes back centuries.
It gets its name from a 19th century politician named Elbridge Gerry. As governor of Massachusetts, he helped shape a congressional district so blatantly one-sided that one critic said it looked like a salamander. No, another replied, a gerrymander.
Now, that counted as a joke in 1810, back when your entertainment options were sunsets, Washington Irving novels, and getting kicked by a horse. And quick side note, you are not wrong to notice that the Jerry in gerrymander refers to a guy whose name was actually pronounced Gerry, because literally everything about gerrymandering is stupid and wrong. And look, there is nothing inherently wrong with redrawing a voting district. It's actually necessary. They need to have around the same number of people in them, and populations shift over time as people move or die or emigrate to America because their stand-up careers have endured what might be best characterised as a pogrom of indifference. And that is why every 10 years we have a census, after which lines are redrawn for both the US House and state legislatures. The problem is, in most states, the lines are drawn by politicians. In fact, in 37 states, the drawing of state legislative districts is primarily controlled by the legislators themselves. And they have a pretty clear vested interest there. And if you think that seems crazy, you're not alone.
Every fall, I speak to 5 or 6 members of the British Parliament that come over to shadow members of Congress. And one of the things I have to explain to them is, here's how you get elected to the House. I see these shocked looks on these British faces. And one time one stood up and said, well, that's terrible. That's not the voters choosing their representatives. That's the representatives choosing their voters.
First, that's racist. and second, even I find it difficult hearing advice on map drawing in a British accent that once said, I don't see why one scrap of dust is any different from another, so I ended the border here because that's where my pen ran out of ink. They'll learn to like it. What's the worst that can happen? But it is true that if your party holds the redistricting pen, it wields substantial power, and there are multiple techniques at its disposal.
There are a couple of ways that you can reapportion people and put them into districts, and there's a thing called packing and there's a thing called cracking.
Yes, packing and cracking. Not to be confused with the teen drug trend of cracking and packing, which is when the teens hollow out a cucumber, fill it with crack, and put it in their anus to absorb it faster. I saw it on the local news, which means it's real, and every teenager is doing it right now. But in this context, packing means cramming as many opposition voters as possible into just a few districts. And cracking means spreading them out thinly over a bunch of districts so they can't gain a majority in any one of them. Either way, it dilutes their impact. Try and think of it as table assignments at a wedding. You can either break up your 8 awful relatives and spread them out over different tables, or you can pack them all together in one insufferable table of the damned. The Washington Post showed how this can work. Look at this hypothetical state. It's 60% blue voters, 40% red, and it needs to be carved up into 5 districts. Now, proportionally, you would want 3 blue and 2 red districts. But if you draw the lines like this, you can get 3 red majorities and 2 blues. And if you draw it like this, you can get 5 blue majorities and no red. And if you draw lines like this, it looks like a dick, which is irrelevant to this discussion, but it is objectively very funny. And if you are thinking, shouldn't all of this be illegal? Well, that's complicated, because if you're gerrymandering to disadvantage minorities, yes, that is illegal under the Voting Rights Act. But if you're gerrymandering to disadvantage voters of an opposing party, that has generally been allowed. So racial gerrymandering? No. Partisan gerrymandering, that's kind of okay. And it's led politicians to be pretty brazen in their behaviour, like in North Carolina last year. Their congressional map was thrown out in federal courts for racial gerrymandering, which is wrong, so they had to redraw. And while doing it, State Rep David Lewis went out of his way to explain that the new map would not illegally fuck over minorities, it would just legally fuck over Democrats.
We want to make clear that we, to the extent, are going to use political data in drawing this map, it is to gain partisan advantage on the map. I want that criteria to be clearly stated and understood.
I need you to understand, this is not a race thing, because it can't be. We just want a map that churns out Republicans like it's Ann Romney. That is all we're saying. That is all we are saying here. Please let me understand. And that map worked. In 2016, despite Republicans winning just over half the votes in House races, they wound up controlling 77% of the state seats. That is a more blatant disregard for what people want than the arsehole who gives out Bazooka Joe on Halloween. Oh, great, gum from the Roosevelt administration wrapped in a comic from the other Roosevelt administration. At least the guy handing out Snickers stuffed with razor blades actually gives you a Snickers. And Republicans elevated this technique to an art form with a plan called Red Map, or the Redistricting Majority Project. They poured more than $30 million into state-level races ahead of the last redistricting, gaining huge numbers of seats, and that paid massive dividends.
When Republicans won the majority of state houses in 2010, it ensured they'd be redrawing the maps in those states. And lo and behold, it paid off in 2012. Nationwide, Democrats running for Congress got 1.1 million more votes, but Republicans sent 33 more members to the House.
Exactly. So the maps they drew put Democrats at a significant disadvantage. It's like if, instead of Tim Duncan, the San Antonio Spurs had to use Tim Burton. It's not technically impossible to win, but it's going to be much, much harder. And look, to some extent, Republicans got lucky because 2010 was a wave election for their party. And I'm not saying Democrats are angels here, by no means. When they have had control, they have gerrymandered the shit out of districts in states like Maryland. And they've been pretty brazen too. Take Illinois. In 2001, the Democrats won the right to redistrict there after, and this is for reasons too complicated and too stupid to explain, a name was pulled out of a replica of Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat. But just watch as one Democratic lawmaker made the least convincing promise ever.
Well, we'll sit down and draw a very fair map.
Come on. Come on. That's an inherently suspicious look on his face. That's the exact expression of someone who just urinated in a public pool. Huh. Water's warm today, huh? Enjoy your swim. So how do you know if your district has been drawn with nefarious intent? Well, that's tricky, because too often people will just lazily point to districts that have a weird shape.
North Carolina's 12th district looks like spilled coffee. Pennsylvania's 16th is flexing its muscles. And one commentator compared Maryland's 3rd to a broken-winged pterodactyl. And then there's this. They call it the earmuffs.
Ah, yes, an earmuff district. Not to be confused with the earmuff district, which is a one-block area of Manhattan where sketchy men sell accessories made from the fur of endangered species. You should go. You should visit. But while it is tempting to see something suspicious in an odd-shaped district, there is a pretty good argument against prioritising tidy lines above all else.
Dropping a bunch of squares seems fair. It seems like if you could just draw a grid, like Tron, that you could put people into districts and there wouldn't be any sort of manipulation in the process. But Americans don't live, with the exception of Montana and a few other square places, Americans don't live in squares. Our communities are irregular and random.
Yeah, that's true. American communities are not square. They're like jazz music. They're free-form, free-flowing, and they contain a troubling amount of opioids. And there is no one right way to draw a district. Reasonable people will disagree. Some might prioritise a district being politically competitive. Others might favour compactness. Others want to keep so-called communities of interest together. The problem is, it may be physically impossible to do all three of those things in one place. In fact, take that earmuff district. The thin line connecting the two halves is just a single road, and people love to make fun of that.
In Chicago, squeezed between two freeways, this narrow strip is needed to connect two halves of a gerrymandered district to keep it contiguous, as is required.
This is the way Congress gets around the contiguous rule, because there's obviously nobody living here. I mean, unless they're homeless people, I guess. Anybody here? Any congressional voters out there?
Now, you may laugh, but a few seconds later, an entire ghost baseball team from the early 1900s walked out of the tall grass and beat him to death with their ghost bats. And he kind of deserved it. But here is the thing, though. It is drawn like earmuffs for good reasons, because the northern and southern parts are two Latino communities, and the district in the middle is predominantly African-American. Now, both are Democratic, so it's not about partisan advantage, it's about ensuring that both communities have representatives serving their interests. And it's criticised a lot, but redistricting experts absolutely love it. In fact, two of them actually put it on their wedding cake. That is a real wedding cake. And I'm guessing that the bachelorette party cake was something like one more night of packing and cracking. So to break it down, not all weird-shaped districts are bad, and not all normal-shaped districts are good. And there is one more thing. Gerrymandering is not the sole reason for the mismatch between our popular vote percentages and our representation. Some of that is due to where Democrats choose to live.
Democrats live in the wrong places, basically.
Yeah.
They've decided to cram themselves in cities, and that just makes it really hard to have a winning coalition when your people do that. If you're college educated, if you want to work in the creative economy, you move to a city, and those places have enough Democrats already. Democrats need to make places like Des Moines or Columbus or Raleigh, North Carolina, cool so that those young people move there, but that's kind of outside the typical realm of political strategy.
Wait, what do you mean, make Des Moines cool? They've already got the Des Moines Heritage Carousel, the most badass balls-to-the-wall carousel in the whole Midwest. And yes, according to their website, it is closed for the season of spring, which is not a good time for carousels, but when May 28th rolls around, it's going to be an all-out carousel fuckstravaganza until 8 p.m. But it is true. Democrats are basically packing themselves into districts, and that is not likely to change anytime soon. But there is a broader, non-partisan point here, and that is that in a democracy, the question of who gets to draw the map should not have as much significance as it currently does. Now, there is actually a Supreme Court case coming up involving a redistricting in Wisconsin that was so partisan, a lower court struck their maps down, and the Supreme Court may, for the first time, actually issue a clear ruling putting limits on partisan gerrymandering. So all of our hopes are now in the delicious claws of Justice Neil Gorsuch. But even without a ruling, many experts argue we should simply be taking redistricting out of the hands of politicians and give the task to independent commissions. And that's a pretty good idea. In fact, a handful of states already do some version of that. And it's not perfect. It is tough to completely remove partisan biases, a fact that one state lawmaker brought up to shoot the idea down.
If I felt there were any way in the world that I could stand before my constituents and say, I believe that it's possible to come up with a group of people who have no political bias whatsoever, who will simply sit down in a room and magically create districts, I'd be behind it. I'd be behind it 100%. But those people don't exist.
Now, if you recognise that guy, it's because you saw him about 10 minutes ago reassuring everyone that his intent in drawing districts was to gain partisan advantage for Republicans. So he's essentially arguing, nobody's unbiased, so let's use me, the most brazenly biased man in the universe. Which is pretty much arguing, no babysitter is perfect, so let's just use Slender Man. But while independent commissions might not be perfect, they would definitely be better. And the truth is, it is hard to come up with a worse system than the one most states currently have. And there is something very important at stake here. Lawmakers should not be allowed to dilute our votes by drawing their own lines and essentially picking their own voters. And you know what? I will tell you why. The foundations of democracy are built on the idea that everybody's vote should count equally. Everybody's. That is what America is all about. That every one of us should get an equal chance to make a bad decision which fucks things up for everybody else. Whoever we are, however poor our decisions, whether you are a juggalo, stop it, or a 47-year-old Quidditch player.
It's a sport!
Or someone who bought that stupid $6,000 jacket I wore on the show last week. It's horrible. Our voices should be fully heard, even if we're Scientologists, or parrot heads, or guys who ride unicycles as their primary mode of transportation. In this one context, we should all be relevant, regardless of our questionable life choices. Whether you're an EDM bro, or a guy jamming a knife into a toaster, or a Washington Redskins fan, or even a Jill Stein supporter.
She would have won.
How would she have won? What process could she have used to... The point is, her voice should count as much as anyone else's, as much as a guy in a fedora, or a baker of erotic pastries, or a SantaCon attendee, or everyone's racist grandma. Don't say anything. Because at the end of the day, that is the point of this country. That's what made America great. Because think about it. Election results should not be the fault of lawmakers' crazy lives. They should be the result of our own crazy decisions. Am I right? Am I right? That's our show. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next.